Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome this afternoon. We won't keep you a minute or two longer. We're just waiting for the rest of our guests to filter onto the call. Over to you, James. Thank you. Thank you, James. We'll leave you into your capable hands now. Good afternoon, everyone.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Julia, and good afternoon to everybody. And welcome on pre-budget day, which is an incredibly well-timed discussion, I think, where we are going to hold the latest in our series of webinars around the new trading relationship between the UK and the EU, and a couple of the key thematic issues which are falling out from that. We have an expert panel today, really superb panel drawn from some really interesting bits of the business and government architecture. I'll introduce each of them in a second and ask them just to say a couple of bits, a couple of introductory remarks. So far, these discussions have been full, frank, interesting, and I've certainly found them very insightful. We do encourage people from the audience to ask questions. There's a Q&A function which should be at the bottom of your screen. If you could put them in there, I will do my best to get as many of them answered as possible, but interest in these things is pretty high, and I'm afraid we can't promise we'll get all of them done. I should also say that we will answer the questions as put to us, but a lot of these things in terms of applying to your own business are very fact specific. So, you know, you'll have to still think about looking for specific advice on key business questions. But I think in general, we found these tend to be incredibly helpful, albeit that things can move fast in this space, as I'm sure a lot of you are finding. And what is true today may not be true in a week's time. So whilst this video will go up on YouTube, and hopefully people can keep referring to it, that is a little bit of a health warning from those kind of slightly watching in the future. But I'll come onto the panel today, who do link with the BCC in a number of ways, both through our 53 UK chambers and our many, many more international chambers that form the Global Business Network. And actually, it's from the Global Business Network that our first participant today is drawn. So it's with my very great pleasure, I'd like to introduce Lynn from the Netherlands Chamber of Commerce, who's going to give us a really interesting sense of the view from, I'm going to say Holland, but Netherlands. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for inviting me. It's quite remarkable because we have received a lot of questions from our members, and we spent quite some time on helping them together with other organizations in the Netherlands. But on data and services so far, it's been quite few questions that we have received, and what I think plays a role, because it's quite remarkable, I think it has to do with the travel restrictions, because a lot of service providers currently do not travel. It also has to do that the services changes, so the rules are less in your face than with the new border formalities for goods. If you don't have your administration organized, you can't get the parcel from one country to the UK. But for services, you can still, in principle, step in the airplane and do your work if it was not for COVID, of course. And thirdly, what I also think plays a role is that there's quite a strong fragmentation of service providers, regulators. So there's not really one umbrella, one coordinated approach to raise awareness on the changes for services. So we've seen relatively few questions on services, and to be honest, it's a bit worrying, because the services sector is very large. For the UK, it makes up 80% of the UK economy, but also 40% of Dutch exports are services. So it is quite large, and although the TCA is very ambitious on services compared to other FTAs, there are huge differences with the free movement of trade in services, which there were under EU membership. So there are a lot of changes. Thirdly, I think trading in services has become more complicated and details matter. So it's very important for the people to be aware of what the changes are. It requires a lot of knowledge on the sector, on the specifics for that case, and clarity often only comes after the entire application process. So for me, it's a bit worrying that that we have still received so few questions. What we receive from our members is very much based around 3 key themes. It's about the immigration rules. Do I need a work permit? Do I need a residence permit? How long will this process take? What will it cost? Very practical issues. So a lot around VAT and also about bringing machines and applications without having to pay VAT. And thirdly, around the recognition of professional qualifications. If it is recognized, will it stay? Will there be national differences between Austria and Italy, for example? So that's the third round of questions. And on data, a lot of companies are not so worried about that. One question that comes up is, will the data adequacy decision, if it comes, be contested? And the other one is very much about the ICO and the supervisory authority in the EU. So that's basically what we see around services and data with our members in the Netherlands.
Lynn, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. VAT is definitely a topic that keeps recurring on a number of levels, so much so we're actually going to run a specific, this is a plug here, isn't it, webinar around VAT next week. I mean, I really clearly should be on the BBC doing this kind of silly rollover, but it's one of the difficult things, and I personally haven't ventured into it yet because it gets pretty complex pretty quickly. But that's such a useful analysis. Thank you very much. And I thought, in particular, around the data services issue and some of those questions coming up, I thought that segued rather beautifully into our second panelist. We have Jenny with us, who is a senior civil servant in the heart of Whitehall, who has been working around data policy and adequacy for quite some time, and I think probably gets a lot of credit for some of the successes that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So without going too far on that, Jenny, if I might ask you just to give your introductory remarks building on Lynn's fabulous foundations, please.
Thank you, James, and yes, hello everyone. I head up a team at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, leading on international data policy. So yes, have been closely involved in the work to date on data adequacy and indeed the data provisions within the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So I'll just say a few quick comments on the actions that we as government have taken, and I'll indeed point to the good news from a couple of weeks ago. So ensuring the continued free flow of data between the UK and the EU is what we're after, basically. It matters for both sides. It matters for, I suspect, most, if not all of you on the call here today. Flows of data underpin basically every aspect of our modern life, whether that's government, law enforcement, businesses, other organisations, or indeed citizens. So we are delighted to confirm that as of 10 days or so ago, the Commission has now published its positive assessment of the UK's data protection regime. Those draft, what are called adequacy decisions, were published at the end of last month, and you can take a look at them and see a bit more detail if you'd like. But I just thought I'd say a word on what that actually means. So adequacy decisions confirm the Commission's assessment that a third country's data protection standards are essentially equivalent to the EU's. And that then allows the free flow of personal data from the EU to adequate countries. The Commission, as I say, has now concluded their process. Before those decisions actually come into effect, there's a little bit more process to go through with some of the other EU institutions. Notably, we need to wait for an opinion from the European Data Protection Board. The European Parliament will also comment, and then the member states at the Council of the EU will vote on it. So it's a really, really positive first step, and kind of the work that we've done over several years, but actually the kind of assessment phase over the last year, the kind of intense period, has now concluded. And we hope that that adoption process will conclude swiftly and be uncomplicated. In the meantime, we have what is known as a bridging mechanism in place at the moment after the end of the transition period. This was agreed within the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and it basically does what it says on the tin, kind of bridges the moment in time from the end of the transition period to when adequacy decisions are in place and fully adopted and come into effect. That bridge lasts until the 30th of June, so we have a little bit of time to kind of work through those remaining institutional requirements. And for now, you shouldn't see any difference to the rules that your data is flowing under as compared to the transition period. So it really has been a sort of moment to just maintain what was in place previously while we worked through the end of this process. The process is outside of the UK's control at this point. It is a commission-led process, but we're continuing to engage really closely with them and to encourage to conclude this as quickly as they possibly can. But given it's outside of their control, it would it'd be wrong if I didn't say therefore organisations may want to make their own risk assessments and consider putting in place alternative mechanisms. And I can talk a little bit more about that in questions in due course, if that would be helpful. I just wanted to say one quick word on some of the broader data provisions in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So the adequacy assessment is separate from the broader TCA. And in that broader agreement, there are, if you're interested, you will see there are some other provisions seeking to enable cross-border data flows and to limit the restriction of those flows, and particularly to limit data localization requirements, which is the requirement to store or process data in a given territory in which you're doing business. And we know that that can create additional costs and burdens for businesses. So we are delighted that we managed to secure that agreement with the EU at the end of last year. And finally, there are some provisions in that agreement as well around regulatory cooperation, so how we ensure that the Information Commissioner's Office, the data protection regulator here in the UK, can operate really effectively with the European Data Protection Board and, of course, national data protection authorities as well. So there's a commitment to ensuring that works well too. But let me pause there. Hopefully that gives you a brief overview, and very happy, of course, to take questions.
Jenny, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And it's really interesting to get it from the inside track, as it were. It's clearly a very good result, but plenty to do. And I always feel whenever I've used the phrase, you may wish to, what I tend to be implying is you really bloody should. But I think that also brings us on wonderfully to our third panelist. We've actually got 4 today, which is excellent. We decided to really go hard for it today, but I'm going to come to Alex next, who is the chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in Germany, a certified chartered accountant and a partner at Blick Rothenberg in the city. So Alex, we've got you coming in 3 different capacities. It'd be fabulous to hear your views around data and services so far, and how you think it's gone from the German perspective as much as anything.
Yeah, thank you very much, James, and good afternoon to everyone. Very grateful for the invitation to participate today. My name is Alex Altman. I'm a partner at Blick Rothenberg. We are a London-based firm of accountants, and I have quite a bit of international exposure with client work. I'm also heading up our German team in the firm, and I advise quite a lot of businesses with trade between the EU and the UK. And as James said, I'm also one of the chairmen of the British Chamber in Germany, so quite a bit involved in British-German trade. What is my view on where we currently are and where we are going? Well, before the trade deal was presented to us on Christmas Eve, we knew that the new customs border will be a significant issue for businesses on both sides. It will take some time for businesses to adapt. I was also not surprised that the majority of businesses in Britain were not prepared for this change, and the result is that many are now struggling with selling their goods into the European Union. The customs border won't go away unless we rejoin the customs union at some point, but I think that discussion probably won't start with this government, and because of that, I think British-European trade will significantly change over the next few years, with lower trading volume in goods between the UK and the EU, and maybe a greater emphasis on services and also on data, of course. I was then surprised when I started reading through the trade deal just after Christmas, that this trade deal does not include many provisions for the services sector, which is really strange if you consider that over 80% of our economic output is earned with services in the UK. But obviously there was not enough time to negotiate a really comprehensive free trade agreement covering all sectors of our economy in less than 11 months' time during a pandemic. And clearly the teams had to focus on goods first to keep vital items moving and could not focus as much on services. So we ended up leaving the common trading framework with our biggest trading partner with no deal for our services sector. That's the reality. This is obviously no good news for crucial sectors like financial services or various professional services. And we can already see the very significant ramifications for many service sector companies. I think we all agree that this trade deal is at best a first version or a skeleton, and much more content must be added over the months and years to come to improve the status quo of British-EU trade. It was mentioned that European Commission has now granted UK data adequacy, which is a first positive sign that things are moving forward, but I think much more has yet to be done.
Fabulous, Alex. I think that's right, and it's very difficult to disagree with that analysis. I think it's fair to say that services do form the backbone of the UK economy, and actually the provisions governing them are significantly less developed than we might have hoped. And I'm sure that raises all sorts of questions we'll touch on for the next hour or so. That was really helpful. Thank you so much, Alex, and yeah, for bringing that really good pan-European, pan-global perspective. And I think it's something that, having worked in a few BROs and done a few webinars, we don't tend to get in a lot of places. So I think that's the real value. So we're going to round off with our final panelist today, who is Sally Jones, who joins us from Ernst & Young, where she's a partner. She heads up the Brexit and international trade, I think it's team and/or function. So Sally, it's been a quiet 4 months. I would say that the most interesting bit actually is your webpage has just astronomer on. At some point, we're going to have to ask you all about that, but maybe that comes slightly outside services, if not maybe data. But Sally, if I can just come to you just for final your introductory remarks, and then we'll start throwing some questions. So hello, Sally.
Hello, delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. I thought I would take a slightly different approach. I want to give your audience a model for analysing what impact the UK leaving the EU might have on their services trade. Because we found in our various client conversations that you can boil it down to the answers to 3 critical questions, which are: is there anything that now stops you doing your thing in the way you used to do it or at all? Can you go to where you want to do your thing? And if you can't go to where you want to go, can you do it remotely? And if you break it down into those 3 questions, then you get to an answer as to, do I have a problem or do I not? Now, those 3 questions are easy to ask. They're not so easy to answer, of course. So let's take each of those in turn. The first thing, does something now stop you doing what you want to do? That's a regulatory question. And it pretty much boils down to, what's the domestic regulation in the country that you want to provide your service to? Now, probably the question that we get more often than any other in response to this is, well, do I really have to look at the domestic legislation in every country that I trade in? And I'm afraid that the answer is yes, you do. I'm really sorry. It's important, if not vital, that you put in the hard yards and review what it is that the domestic legislation requires you, what obligations you're required to meet. Now, That is not easy. In some of the countries of the EU, the legislation is not translated into English. In some of the countries of the EU, even when it is translated into English, it uses terms that we in England and Britain are not familiar with. But nevertheless, it is really important to go through those hard yards. There will be some businesses that discover that they are not regulated in the country in which they wish to do business, which is happy days, because there is nothing then that stops them doing what they want to do. If you do have a domestic regulation problem, the next port of call is the free trade agreement. Is there something within that that relieves you of that domestic obligation requirement? And now this is where I get cross with free trade agreements, because if you had a blank sheet of paper and you're trying to design them in a way that is user-friendly for business, this is not what you would come up with. Because the way a free trade agreement works is you start with upfront what are called the commitments, not the excellent Irish film and band, but instead the commitments are the agreements, what each country, each state has agreed up front it will do to make things better for business. And oftentimes you'll read the commitments and you'll think, fantastic, I have some relief from the problem that was bothering you. However, then you have the reservations. It would be really helpful if the reservations were put in the free trade agreement immediately after the relevant commitments, but no, that would be too much of a straightforward thing to do. Instead, what the trade negotiators do is they dot the reservations, which is where countries say, actually, that thing we committed to, we're not going to do after all. They dot them all the way through the rest of the free trade agreement in seemingly random fashion. It's like they've created, the trade negotiators, a little scavenger hunt to keep us all entertained. But you do then have to read the commitments, work out if you've got something that relieves your provisions, and then read the reservations to find out if they've taken them all away again. And oftentimes they do. So if you read the reservations around legal services, for example, in the TCA, then of the 27 member states, 15 of them have put unbound reservations in place, which means that legal services can't be provided after all. The other thing just to be aware of, and this is one that's causing my clients increasing problems, is that TCA does include a 12-month restriction on the duration of contracts for services. So if, as one of my clients used to do, you provide training services on 3-year terms to your clients in the EU, that's not going to be okay anymore. There is no provision to do that on a 12-month basis, on anything longer than a 12-month basis. So you know, my client in that instance is having particular concerns where their clients are coming to them and saying, we really like what you do, but one, we can't be certain that you can deliver training where we want you to deliver it, and two, we wanted somebody who could deliver training over a 3-year period. Sorry, we're going to find someone else. That's the first question, things to look out for that might stop you doing your thing. Next question is, can you go where you want to go in order to deliver your service? And this comes back to the point that Lynn was making early on about travel restrictions. And again, this breaks down into 2 places. There's, do I need a visa to be in the country I want to be, and can I physically enter that country? And do I need a work permit once I'm in there? The visa question is again tripping people up already, because what the visa question says is that you can do visits from the UK to a member state or vice versa for 90 days in any rolling period. But firstly, that 90-day period includes holidays. So if you've got somebody who spent 3 weeks with the kids in France on holiday and then has a 4-month project in the Netherlands, that might well need a visa when it wouldn't otherwise do so because the 90-day period has been breached. And the second thing is there are actually quite stringent restrictions on what counts as a business visit in any case. And so if you're not a business visitor or you're not in the 90-day period, then you will need a visa to enter the country you want to enter. And then there's a separate set of questions about, do I now need a work permit in that country to do my work? And that's a question about whether or not you have looked at the domestic regulation again, 27 different countries, 27 different sets of regulation, 27 different rules. Now then, supposing you can't go where you want to go, then the next question, the third and final of my questions is, can I share my data? Now, I'm not going to pretend to be anything like as erudite as Jenny. When it comes to this, she is absolutely the expert, but it's not a small question, because if you get it wrong, you face an enormous GDPR 4% of global turnover type fine. And a number of my clients have said, look, the risk we think is low, But if we are tripped up by this, the cost to us would be so high. We are going to look at putting provisions in place just in case we can't continue to flow data without them, whether it's putting in place standard contract clauses to their client contracts, or whether putting in corporate rules within their group. A number of my clients are genuinely taking that route, even despite the good news from last week. Final tip before I shut up and give you guys a chance to ask your questions is the Information Commission Office's website is a fantastic and free resource. I would encourage anybody who has to transfer data cross-border to take a look at it. It has clauses you can lift and insert directly into your contracts, so you don't need to pay consultants like me for that advice. Fantastic resource, do check it out. It's really, really worthwhile. And with that, I'm going to pass back to James.
No, fabulous. Thank you so much. That was superb. I've written down your tripartite structure. I shall be stealing and applying it, which is the sincerest form of flattery. Also, I have got the commitments running through my head, and I've never heard a consultant before say, here's how you don't have to employ me. But so we've ticked a lot of boxes there, but that was fabulous. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists. And we're already getting some really, really good questions. And I think it's fair to say a few of them are a little bit data focused first. So I'm going to come to you, Jenny, in the first instance, if that's okay. And I think one flows from your point around risk assessments. You basically invited this in the intro. So it's arguably prudent. You may wish to do one as a company, and I think Sally has spoken very nicely, very well there about, despite the bridging agreement, despite the adequacy coming, it might make sense to kind of do a belt and braces approach, given the balance between risk and potential catastrophic fine if you get it wrong. You know, do you have any hints and tips around that? In what circumstances should you do it? Is it something that's only for big companies, or do you think it's equally applicable to SMEs who form the bulk of our membership, at least?
Yeah, thanks, James. So, I mean, look, organisations will have to make their own sort of judgments on this, and I fully agree with what Sally was saying. The ICO website has an awful lot of really good guidance on some of this, and to your last point, has specific guidance for SMEs for whom there might be slightly different requirements. And again, a lot of the tools that they have designed are to kind of drag and drop into specific agreements. So do kind of take a look at that and make use of the guidance where you can. I mean, in terms of confidence, the Commission has published its decisions, and they are positive decisions. The Commission has just spent the best part of 12 months looking very, very closely at the UK regime, asking us all sorts of extremely difficult questions, and has clearly satisfied itself that the UK is adequate. So I think we can take a lot of confidence from that. We also, of course, are starting out from, no other country has started out from exactly the same set of rules and kind of same position. So I think in that sense, we do take, certainly we take a lot of confidence from that. And where are we now, sort of start of March, we do still have 4 months for the residual EU processes to run through. The only issue is they are outside of our control. As Sally says, even if the likelihood is low, some of the risk, some of the impact here can be high. So it is one for organisations to keep an eye on. Those changes, it depends on the setup of your business, but a number of those changes, should they be required, should we end up in that worst case scenario, can be made relatively quickly, relatively smoothly. Again, especially if you make use of what is already available on the ICO website and consider working through how you apply to your business, but using the standardized contractual clauses in the first instance. But I think, certainly from where I sit, we are fairly confident this is a really good result. We just can't quite say absolutely, which is why I just want to make sure that people are sort of keeping an eye on this as this goes forward.
No, thank you, Jen. That's very helpful. And you definitely put my attempt to trip you into saying something unwise very much into a box. So that's fabulous. Thank you. And I'm going to, take Chair's prerogative and come back with a second question, if that's okay, around data. So we've got quite a good case study here. So we've got a software company, EU customers holding what I imagine must be their personal data, name, address, bank account, foot size, etc., whatever you can think of is required to be held. I suppose do they need to move that data into an EU setting now? Might they need to in the future? And if they don't, which I'm hoping is going to be the answer, what kind of steps might they have to take now to abide by the law as it is in terms of appointing representatives or what have you?
Yeah, of course. So yes, the short answer is no, absolutely. You do not have to do that. So if, as I was just saying, those positive decisions are fully approved and ratified in the next few months, then you don't need to do anything. You certainly don't need to do anything at the moment. The free flow of personal data, which I'm assuming that is, of your customers over there and in the UK, is absolutely covered by the bridging period that we're currently in. If the adequacy decisions are fully approved, it will be covered by a positive adequacy status for the UK. Should that decision not be approved for some reason, that's then where you get into these alternative mechanisms of transfers. So standard contractual clauses are the most sort of normal ones that, again, there is information on the ICO's website. There are some others depending on the kind of nature of the business, but those are the things that you would need to consider at that point if for some reason the adequacy process hadn't concluded positively in the next few months.
No, perfect, thank you. That's reassured me a huge amount, not least because that's what I thought was the case, but it's always good to triple check these. I'm going to move a little bit off data now, I think, onto services for a bit, but don't worry, Jenny, based on the volume of questions, we'll definitely be coming back to you later. And Alex, actually, I'm just going to ask you a question. A few people have raised VAT, which I think is a serious issue. We have a seminar next week, but I'm going to try and learn a little bit now in advance of that so I can ask some better questions next week as much as anything. But, is that a problem? Is that something your clients, your contacts are coming to you? Are they telling you that VAT is an issue? And without getting to the details, is it around the complexity of the rules, or is it that actually the rules, they are understood, but they are just pretty difficult to trade around?
Thanks, James. It's a very good question. I see in our practice that many UK businesses are not aware yet that they might enter potentially with a VAT liability in the country where their customer is based in the European Union. And the reason is the European Union introduced for electronically supplied services a scheme called MOS about 6 years ago, which says if you sell an electronic service to a consumer in another European country, you are liable to account for local VAT. However, you don't have to register for VAT locally because you transfer the VAT to Revenue and Customs, and then Revenue and Customs takes care of transferring these VAT figures to each particular finance authority in the European country. So it's a very simplified VAT reporting scheme that was in place, which was a very fair mechanism to evenly distribute VAT into the country where the consumer is based. The UK has left the European single market now, left the VAT regime, and if a British business provides an electronic service to consumer in any EU member state, they must register now for VAT in that particular country and charge local VAT. At this stage, no one stops their business to sell a service to that particular country. However, if the local VAT authority finds out that a service is provided, they can go after the UK business and chase for VAT payment. So it's very important that every business understands their tax obligations now. Even if these services are provided digitally, they might still end up with a registration requirement.
Thank you, Alex. That's really handy. And one of the questions we've had is around a single service provider in the UK, let's say live streaming paid for yoga classes. I don't know, I've gone with yoga, we're in lockdown, but have something to do to 6 different EU states. Does that potentially require 6 different VAT registrations with 6 paperwork trails and 6, accountant people looking at it and structuring the paperwork?
So there is the option to just register in one single European country and continue filing MOS VAT returns for all of the now 27 European countries. However, that only works if you proactively register for a MOS VAT scheme in one EU country. Many go to Ireland these days because of the common language. However, if you fail to do that proactively and you just continue selling to your customers in these countries, you will end up with VAT liabilities in each of the 6 countries you mentioned. So the learning point is review your supply chain, understand where you have potential tax liabilities, and proactively sign up to simplifications where you can.
No, fabulous. Thank you. That's really helpful, Alex. And that the MOS VAT scheme is absolutely one of, I think, the takeaways, as is actually on data. Look at the ICO's website, ico.gov.uk, which a couple of us chucked in. That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. I'm going to spin it around a little bit now, Lynn, because I think Alex has highlighted a key question there, which is some of the rules are pretty impenetrable for UK companies trading into the EU, to put it mildly. Certainly, one might have liked more than 6 days to prepare for them. But from your perspective, dealing with Dutch businesses looking to trade into the UK, how do they find the guidance coming the other way? You know, and you touched on some of their main questions. And are there things that UK companies might be able to do to work with, you know, long-standing trading partners in Utrecht, etc., to try and help smooth that?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Indeed, we receive quite a lot of questions from companies that would like to have more guidance from the UK, that don't necessarily always find their answers on the websites of the UK. So I do think that more guidance would be very helpful. In fact, I would not find it a very strange idea if, when we know when the travel restrictions are going to be lifted, if we start a campaign with the chambers or with the organizations that are very well informed to raise awareness for the changes in the field of services, and also to educate on the changes and where they can find all the information, because I think a lot of awareness and knowledge is still missing, and I expect that to become more important and more urgent once we know that the travel restrictions will be lifted. So I think indeed there is still a job for us to be done. And I also saw a question from one of our members from Sietske de Groot, and she said a lot of service providers think nothing will change for them. And then I would say, please, everyone, look at your business and look in your sector and check. And I think those questions from Sally are very helpful because, as said earlier, I think there will be a lot of changes. So I do think there's still absolutely some work to be done.
Oh, fabulous, Lynn. I think it's very difficult to disagree with a single word of that. I spend quite a lot of my working life trying to read through these things, and I really struggle despite quite a background in all sorts of these bits and pieces. So I'm glad it's not just me, and absolutely would echo, you know, it's not too late. It's never too late. Changes are required, but with a bit of forward planning and maybe a little bit of unhelpful investment, we can get there.
James, if I may add one thing, I think what's also very important is that companies start preparing their personnel planning a little bit longer in advance, so that they have a clearer succession planning or a plan on who they want to travel and let's travel when, so that there's more planning and there's more time for them to prepare for work permits, resident permits, etc. So then it's less easy. So they need to be aware and investigate it a bit longer in advance. And I think that level of awareness would be great to raise as well.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, it cuts both ways. I'm just trying to imagine my wife's face if I explain to her we can't go on holiday next year after 18 months of lockdown because I've had to go and travel with my job, and that's knocked us out. I don't know. I imagine divorces are quite expensive these days, even with relatively meager amounts of assets to distribute. And that actually does bring us on to the second of your questions, Sally. Can I get to where I need to go? Obviously, with the pandemic,
ask for divorce advice for an awful minute. I was going to
no.
area of competence.
No. I think the only advice on divorce is don't, if you can possibly avoid it, because it just ends up making lawyers very expensive. My wife's actually a lawyer, so that's a bit circular. Anyway, this is we do need to do a seminar on divorce law, I think, soon. But in terms of travel and these short-term visas, obviously, you know, your clients are already thinking about the stuff and thinking about what will happen as, you know, we start to unlock, perhaps we go back to something a little bit closer to business as usual. We've seen some announcements around investigating what look very much like COVID travel passes within the EU today. But do you think that actually companies do you think there's going to be a second crunch really as we move into a position where companies look to start traveling and have to take on board this huge additional range of paperwork? And if so, are there a couple of kind of key tips that you would recommend? And obviously Lynn has already said, think ahead and start to plan these things, travel rota, etc. Maybe ask for a bit more money to go on holiday in America. That may be the one. But how would you see that playing out over the next 6 to 9 months, if that is the unlock timetable?
Well, there's actually a couple of points to unpick there, if you'll just bear with me. So the first is, I absolutely agree with what Lynn says. There is an absolute need for all businesses to plan their travel in advance. We're very used to the idea that, if one of my clients in the Netherlands phones me up on a Sunday night and says, get out here on Monday, that I'll just jump on a train or a plane, because that will not be the case going forward. And a well-advised company will have systems in place to track where their people are before they can book travel, for example. So that's the kind of sort of compliance and governance process that we're starting to see companies put in place. Do I think it's going to unlock in the next 6 to 9 months? Yes, I absolutely do. But I would remind you, James, that we do go on holiday and we do go on business trips to the US, and we're used to the whole process. So I think there is a sort of element of how much is structural problem and how much is teething problem, and I suspect that it's going to be a bit of both. I actually think the bigger issue that I just wanted to flag is that on the UK side, at least, we've got a number of unilateral easements. So it's things like various customs procedures don't kick in till 1 April, a whole slew of extra customs procedures kick in 1 July. We've got various regulations which aren't going to be enforced until, in some cases, 2021, in some cases 2023, in some cases 2026. One of the things that I think is hardest for businesses to get around is this very staggered set of changes. It's not one big bang set of changes, which would have been hard, but at least singular. But keeping on top of all of these changes on a rolling basis, I think is quite problematic. And I think anyone that, and I'm looking at Jenny because she is now in my mind the sole representative of the British government in existence, but something on the gov.uk website that just had a list of what changes when, I think would be an enormously valuable thing.
No, I think that's right. And certainly there's a space for an enterprising business representation organisation to start doing some planning around that.
If you should know such an organisation, James, then that would be fantastic.
I have one or two on mind. And also, Jenny, I think we've just promoted you to Prime Minister, which is pretty well, or Chief Secretary to the Cabinet. So, it's one hell of a webinar for people's career, I hope, albeit I'm getting divorced off the back of it. Alex, I might just come to you on that, sorry, before we end up promoting everyone and we make you Lord High Admiral. In terms of qualifications, registration, which is one of the other big things I think that comes out around this. Is that a problem you're seeing either in your representative capacity or in your kind of day-to-day job where you work for an international service provider? Is there an issue there? And is it a problem in quite a piecemeal way? So it's fine in some bits of the EU, not so good in others?
Thank you, James. I think it pretty much depends on what service provider is selling a service to which country. Every country in the EU has a different regulatory framework when it comes to various sectors, for example, accountancy services, legal services, engineering services, etc., etc. I've been dealing with a large firm of architects the other day, London-based. Over 50% of their revenues are international. Very big client base in the European Union. They have obviously lost market access because of missing provisions of professional service providers carrying out their work in the EU. And they have 3 markets where they're very active in the EU, and they have to go to each architecture body in these countries to seek approval to continue providing architecture work. It turns out that it's quite expensive. They need insurance in each of these 3 countries. In one country, there's another issue because they have been asked to set up an establishment, some sort of permanent presence for the local regulatory body to grant permission to provide these architecture service. And at the end of the day, working in the European Union because of the massive cost implications. So this is just one example where I feel this trade deal needs to be improved, especially for professional service providers, because otherwise many of our companies just lose out on opportunities.
Thank you, Alex. I think that's very fair. And at any time, businesses have to be so competitive in services that any additional cost is extremely difficult. But if that was the case in 2019, my God, it's the case so far through 2021. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there, which is the need for working together to look at how this might evolve in various ways. I'm going to come to you, Lynn, if that's okay. Do you think that this is an area, this is a bit of a leading question, where the Global Business Network can come together and help to influence on both sides? I think I'd be intrigued on your view on whether we can help influence both the UK government or advise the UK government and, for example, the German federal government or the government in Holland and see how that goes? Or do you think this is something where we kind of have to let the trail go a bit cold before we start saying, what about this, what about that, what about the other?
Well, I think we can definitely work together. And I think that we are very well positioned as a British Chambers of Commerce network to help and educate our members and see where things can still be improved. So I think absolutely it would be a great idea to work together on that. And I would rather do it sooner than later. I think the sooner we can help companies, the better. They are already in troubles with COVID. So the sooner we can help, the better.
No, I think that's very fair. I'm glad you said that. If you'd gone the other way, then it might have done me out of a job, which would make this the most expensive webinar in history. Sally, can I just come to you? I think we'll probably finish off on a couple of questions around data in a second, but final one on services for now. And obviously without naming any companies or what have you, but do you have a sense of which service providers are facing more insurmountable difficulties, where we might expect the biggest impact to be in terms of their continuing profitability? It's a bit difficult to understand who's really struggling and who the impact of these kind of across the board changes are really going to be on in terms of what I want to call UK PLC, which shows how out of date I am.
Yeah, it's regulated service providers is where it comes down to. And one of the complexities are that sometimes regulation happens at an EU level, as with financial services. So it's large and it's complicated and it's lumpy, but at least it's one set of rules. And then you've got some regulation which happens at domestic levels, and you can get some real surprises for that. So, for example, in the UK, the provision of taxation advice is not a regulated service. Anyone can set themselves up as a tax advisor, and that's fine. But in 11 member states, the provision of tax services is a regulated profession. So it's that kind of situation where you can get a person who has been happily providing UK tax advice to clients for in the EU for a long time, because those clients are just starting out into exporting or setting up an establishment in the UK or that kind of thing, and all of a sudden that's not permitted anymore because that's no longer permitted from a third country, and that's the kind of situation which we're seeing where people are starting to really fall foul of the changes to Brexit. And I'm going to be absolutely brutally honest here. Without any of my clients in mind, but from various conversations I've had in various fora, I know that there are people in the UK who are continuing to provide services in the EU that technically are now unlawful because they just haven't yet got to grips with the changes. And of course, whenever that happens, I'm sort of saying, please don't do that anymore, because you really
I fully agree.
Yeah, totally, Lynn. And it's a real shame because they're not doing anything differently today that they were doing on 31 December. It's just that the rules have the land has shifted under their feet. It's a real problem.
I think that's it. There's no more or less risk. It's the same person delivering the same services to the same clients under the same legal framework, albeit this bit I'm slightly reminded of the first rule of thumb that was drummed into me when I was but an humble young thrusting-ish civil servant, which is the first rule of life is don't get caught. But Jenny, I'm sure you've had your ears diplomatically closed for the last 30 seconds or so, which is very sensible. I'm just going to touch on data a little bit more, just for a couple more questions before we kind of round up a little bit. And you mentioned the need to appoint a data representative, which I think cuts both ways. This is one of the questions that comes up a lot. It feels a bit weird, really, to be frank, given where we've come from and what you said, I think, very well, and what the EU have recognised around the adequacy of GDPR, etc. Can you just tell us how that works? And is that something that's going to have to continue under the deal, or is it something that might go away with adequacy or what have you?
Yeah, thanks, James. And I've seen the specific question, and I'm not a trade lawyer, so I'm hesitant to give a very, very detailed piece of legal advice. However, it's worth remembering here that the kind of legal frameworks covering the deal, the trade deal, and the legal frameworks covering data protection and adequacy are separate. Now, and work has been done, careful work has been done to ensure they are sort of deconflicted. But from where I sit as a kind of heading up the data team, those are the provisions or requirements for you to think about. Article 27 doesn't apply to everyone. It is worth you going to have a look at it, or as I say, I'm going to look at the ICO website, who will do a bit more of a kind of plain language explainer. But there are, even post-adequacy, there are requirements for some organisations, some data controllers and processors, to appoint those EU-based representatives now that we're out of the transition period. There is further guidance on there because it doesn't count, for example, if the processing that you do is only occasional or it's very low risk data. So there are certain requirements for you to kind of look through, and for your data protection officers to look through to kind of get to the bottom of that. So it's definitely not a blanket requirement, but it is something for you to look at and consider as to whether or not it applies to you.
Oh, fabulous, thank you. Having taken advice from trade lawyers in the past, actually, you don't normally get an answer quite that clear and quite that rapid. So that's incredibly helpful. Thank you. And I suppose final question around data, and I may have slightly erred on one of the questions earlier when we talked about what needs to happen. Do you need to move EU personal data into an EU domain? Just to check, where it's non-personal business data, I suppose, so the EU client is loading it onto a platform which is hosted in the UK, does the same, I'm presuming the same analysis must pertain. It doesn't, there's not a stronger set of requirements around non-personal data than personal. He says, crossing his fingers and hoping.
No, that's absolutely right. So it is different systems that govern it. So it's not subject to the adequacy process, but it's what I touched on very briefly in terms of the trade agreement, the anti-localization requirements, which mean there are no requirements on you storing or processing data in a particular area in order to do business in that area. So the answer still stands, but for different reasons, if that makes sense.
No, fabulous. Thank you very much. And I must apologise for having muffed the question up in the first place. So the answer was right, the question was wrong, which says a lot about the panel chair, much more than anything else. So look, we're nearly at the end. It's been a fabulous discussion. I feel like I've learned so much, and I've been working on this for about a year at least. I'm just going to come to each of the panelists in turn, just for maybe a minute or two's worth of kind of closing remark, view to the immediate future. Will things get better? How will they change? What are the top tips? It's really up to you guys as to how you want to squirrel this. So I think we're going to go back to the order we started in. I think that seems fair, albeit we might give Jenny a bit more of a breather because she's just answered the last question. So Lynn, over to you. What's your sense of where we are, whether things will get better, what the main issues are, is it etc. Can anyone give us some hope? That's what I'm looking for. I want to come out of these all happy and smiley the day before budget day and whatever's going to happen on corporation tax.
I think I would like to come back to my previous point, which is a service provider should really look into it and prepare themselves for the changes. And as Sally said, if they don't do that, they can get really tough penalties. So it affects so many of us, especially when the travel restrictions are lifted. So please prepare. And I think it's up to us also to prepare our members and raise awareness on that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. That is superb. A little bit of preparation can save a lot of pain down the line. Alex, if I might come to you, I wonder if you might have some closing remarks from you, whether about the kind of things companies should do, or your forecast, I suppose, of whether the deal might improve and be built upon over time, and where that might focus on.
Yes, sure. I would say, in a nutshell, trade always finds its easiest way. This trade deal has imposed some barriers, some quite unworkable measures, compliance costs for businesses, which at the moment is turning trade away from the European Union and from the UK. I think the UK government should listen to the business community now, listen to trade experts, and we all need to improve this trade deal to allow for a much wider market access for the crucial services sector. The current status quo is, in my view, not acceptable, and we really need to put effort into improve this trade deal in the months and years to come.
Thank you very much, Alex. That sounds very much like some of the discussions we're having in-house about our resourcing and where we put things. So that was really useful insight and intel. Thank you. Sally, I'd be intrigued to hear your closing remarks. How do you feel we're doing against the 3 tests, the 3 questions? Do you think there are other things to watch out for? Are there solutions in this space, or do you think they're just going to be too expensive?
So look, I don't think things are going to improve materially from where they are now in the foreseeable future. I think every business has to assume that this is as good as it's going to get for the time being. You do have to put in the hard yards. Don't assume that things have stayed the same. Do assume that things are going to get more complex, but this does not need to be insurmountable. Get yourself equipped with the facts and then work out what your solutions are. And if you take it coolly, calmly, one step at a time, one bite at a time, you will get to a good answer in the end.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Sally. That was, I think, a really positive note to end on in terms of services. And also data as well, of course, they're equally applicable. So Jenny, we're just going to come to you just for the final thoughts. Obviously, in the heat of the moment, done a lot of incredible stuff around data. There's a little way to go. What should companies be looking out for? What's your timetable? What are the kind of key things we should be looking for? And crucially, are there things that the business community can do that help and assist you in delivering what we all need? That's always the bit of the puzzle that I'm very keen to offer up as much as I can.
Thanks, James. That's really helpful. I mean, look, I think we're also in a really positive place. As I said at the beginning, data is so fundamental; it just sort of underpins everything that we do. But I do recognise it is also quite dry and technical and kind of hard to pull apart sometimes. So, kind of in terms of key things to take away, do look at the kind of guidance that is out there to help break down some of these kind of complicated different arrangements. Do keep an eye on things for the next few months. We are, as I say, we are in a really good position, and we are hopeful that these adequacy decisions will be adopted very shortly. The deadline, as I said at the beginning, is the 30th of June. So have that kind of in your diary. If you haven't seen progress ahead of that, that is the kind of key date to be thinking towards. But look, if we are getting towards that date and things are looking unexpectedly tricky, then I think you can also expect to see more comms and support and guidance coming from my department and DCMS, and also other bits of government, and indeed the ICO. I guess the final message, this is now in the EU's hands. So this now is with the institutions in the EU. There's not anything else that sort of HMG can do. So to the extent that your members are talking to and have voices in those sorts of groups, then that's really helpful. This ensuring the free flow of data between both sides is something that makes sense for all of us, and we really should sort very soon.
Thank you very much. That's incredibly helpful. I don't think anyone would disagree with the notion that data is not a weapon in this context. Data is something where it's like breathing oxygen. It is absolutely essential to modern business on both sides of every channel, and anything we can do to make that work in as smooth a way as possible will be incredibly beneficial. Well, look, that has been fantastic, fabulous, interesting, exciting, innovative, analytical, etc., etc., etc. We've covered UK divorce law, we've covered Roddy Doyle novels, we've had the outlook from Utrecht and Bonn, and actually Whitehall, which is always very interesting. We've talked about data and services, VAT. It's been really, really interesting. And I want to say a really heartfelt thank you to each of the panelists who has educated me and from whom I will be stealing all sorts of ideas, bon mot, witticisms, and working plans over the next couple of weeks, which I think is incredibly helpful. Before I just round up a little bit more fully, I just want to remind everyone that we have another one of these webinars next week. That's on the 9th at 2:30, where we will be talking about VAT. So I'm going to spend the weekend with my nose in a tax textbook, which is not necessarily incredibly easy to say at my advanced age. In summary, I suppose, what would be the key lessons I would say to take away from such a diverse range of topics under data and services? Well, I think the first core message is check. You're running your company, check. Don't just assume things have stayed the same. They might not have done, and they might not be the same for every bit of the EU you used to trade with as one. And that's one of the bits that's shocked me. Check what your data flows look like, understand what your risks are, and think about mitigation strategies, think about the cost of not getting it right versus the cost of perhaps spending a little bit more to over egg. And that's a balance you can only strike, but as long as you have that open internal conversation, that sounds very sensible. There's lots of guidance out there. There's lots of quite simple guidance out there. The difficulty we're finding, I think, is applying general guidance, which is sometimes simple, sometimes a little bit less accessible to detailed business questions. And that's something where I think every company has to look at their own facts and apply it to their own circumstances. And so I think my final point would be to say that there is expert help out there. And I think we've heard from some superb sources of it this week. So just a kind of final plug for Blick Rothenberg, for Ernst & Young, both of whom will very happily provide incredible degrees of insight, help and analysis, and give you that really detailed advice which will help you, I'm sure. Finally, look at the gov.uk website, which has some fantastic stuff as well. And I'm sure Jenny's team are beavering away at providing that in a simple and accessible way. But finally, of course, and I would say this, wouldn't I, the two, I would say, first and most important sources of information and expertise would be the accredited chambers of commerce and the chambers which form the global business network, depending on your needs. I look forward to seeing many of you next week, although none of the panelists who have done their duty and can leave with a smile and their heads held high. So thank you, everyone. Until next week, goodbye.